Good afternoon and welcome to Cold Chain Insights, the podcast that focuses everything temperature controlled logistics for the pharmaceutical industry. My name's Thomas Hunt, and this week I'm delighted to be joined by Nathan White, who is Trade and Distribution Manager Operations at Immedica Pharma. Nathan, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Good to have you on. I think a really nice place to always start is if you could just run us through your career so far, your last few roles, and obviously your current position there. That'd be a good place to kick things off.
Cool, perfect. Yeah, so I've been in the sort of supply chain pharmaceutical logistics industry for the last 9.5 years. So I completed my degree in pharmacology back in 2016, but quite early on in that degree, I kind of realised I didn't want to work in a lab. So I was looking for something else. Fell into a sort of pharmaceutical logistics specialist. It's called Pharma Freight. So I started there as an operations clerk straight out of uni. Spent 4.5 years there kind of learning the ropes of logistics and specifically the sort of pharmaceutical logistics, so temp controlled, cold chain, air freight, road freight, sort of specialised mainly in the sort of European road freight part of the business. Was there through sort of the beginning of Brexit and COVID, which was a challenging time. And then left there, became the logistics manager at a small specialty wholesaler based in the UK called Durbin. So I was sort of responsible for the global logistics of import, export, and a team of around 4 logistics clerks used to work under me. And they kind of did sort of specialty sort of rare disease medication to sort of pharmacies in the UK, and also sort of the managed access programs for patients that can't get hold of medicines in certain countries and extensions of clinical trials. From there, I was there for about a year and then moved over to the manufacturing side of a company called Diurnal. They're sort of a small sort of manufacturer based in the UK, had 2 products on the market at that time, both for sort of hormone replacement for people that couldn't produce cortisol naturally. So I'm the trade and distributions manager there. So my responsibility is, so once our products are packaged at our packaging sites, it's kind of getting them to the patients essentially. So the logistics, managing our distribution centres, GDP compliance from a logistics perspective, and then also sort of managing our partner network as well. So we had like 3 core markets in the UK, Italy, and Germany, where we handle the distribution internally to pharmacies and patients. But for every other market that we supply to, which is about 20, I think, globally, we have sort of in-market partners that we work with. So it was taking their forecasts, putting that into an S&OP process, and then getting the shipments delivered to the customers so that there wasn't any stock outs or anything like that.
Nice. Great. Okay. And as you said, you've sat on 3 different sides of the pharma supply chain, so sort of freight, wholesale, and obviously manufacturing now. And how does your view of risk change depending on where you've sat in your career? And is this one of the more challenging roles that you've done?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think when you're sort of working in freight, and especially as I work in freight, it's probably at the lower end of how you're thinking about risk. You're kind of looking at whether a shipment might get delayed, damaged, or in terms of pharmaceuticals, maybe there's a temp excursion. So that's kind of the main risk you're looking at when you're working freight. But when you sort of move up to wholesale, you kind of have a bit more responsibility for the product. So you're kind of looking, well, will that affect maybe patient supply or the bottom line in terms of if we have to destroy the goods, if it goes wrong during the transit. But then when you step up to the manufacturer, especially working for someone like Immedica Pharma, where it's kind of like a rare disease profile, where there's not too many alternatives and where our supply is kind of not, we don't have that much of a backup supply in terms of additional stock. Your risks increase. You have all the previous risks, but then you're looking at, well, if this shipment is damaged in transit or it's lost or there's a temp excursion, how's that going to affect the actual patient supply onwards? So will we be out of stock in that country? Will that affect our market share going forward? Will we start having patient complaints? That's all the kind of risks you have to take on board when you're working sort of for a manufacturer. Sometimes when you're working for a manufacturer, sometimes you kind of are a bit too risk averse, which becomes sometimes complicated. So I think there's a good middle ground between the risk you have for the freight forwarding side and then also the risk you have for the manufacturing side.
Yeah. Okay. And obviously what you're doing now is around rare disease logistics. I understand. I presume it's a tiny patient population and there's very little buffer stock in that market typically, and no real alternative when you're shipping. What does working in that environment teach you about sort of the mainstream pharma maybe doesn't understand, or what are the sort of challenges you face in there?
I think it's pretty much every shipment matters. So we can have a shipment that will be for that market and it's probably 6 months worth of supply going to that market. If we have any issues with that shipment, we're potentially shorting that market, and then it's kind of, you've got, again, the sort of patient population might be running out. They don't really have an alternative. So I know for one of our products, there's not really much of an alternative for that. And it's a pediatric medicine as well. So it's kind of that, it's an important medicine for everyone involved. And then you've got kind of, it hammers home a bit because we're still quite a small company. So we generally do hear back sometimes from patients will contact us if they can't get hold of the stock. If they're having sort of issues with their pharmacy or a wholesaler's not able to provide them, we will get contacted by patients, doctors, nurses. So you kind of hear that side of the story as well. So it really hits home with you when you're working. Whereas if you're working sort of mainly mainstream pharma, where you may be shipping sort of the bulk products, you're probably not going to hear those stories and really understand.
I also read that the business has scaled quite dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years. As I understand, there's been some acquisitions in there. And what's it been like working within that sort of growth, and how have you managed it in terms of the logistics function there?
So I think for us, we were Diurnal. We were then taken over by Neurocrine Biosciences. But then it was at the beginning of the year we became part of Immedica. So Neurocrine Biosciences sort of sold us off to Immedica. So we probably haven't been involved in that side of the acquisition. But in terms of when we went from Diurnal, which was pretty much a startup, sort of reliant on sort of investor funding, every sort of penny counted. Whereas when you move to sort of Neurocrine Biosciences, which is a fairly large biotech company based out in the US, it more became about, well, we need to ensure patient supply. So what you need to do, whatever you need to do to get patient supply, so whether that's dual sourcing of our manufacturers, increasing the buffer stock, stuff like that became much more important rather than just sort of essentially making every pound count.
Yeah. Okay. And then if we could sort of jump straight into your current role at Immedica and some of the challenges you're facing day to day. When you talk about supply chain optimization day to day and trying to look at that, where do you actually find the biggest inefficiencies hiding, and what have been the biggest wins you've seen over the last few years?
For us, when I joined the company, our forecast modeling wasn't probably where it should be. So we'd had it previously, just as I sort of started, where we'd sort of wildly overestimated how much we were going to sell in our forecasting. So you're at that sort of point where with pharmaceuticals, it's probably got, most of them will have a shelf life. So ours is 3 years, but once it hits the market, it's probably got 18 to 24 months worth of expiry left on it. Mm-hmm. So when the forecasting is out, you're spending money on stock that you're never going to sell, that you're going to have to potentially destroy. You're never going to sell it, so you're losing money that side. Then also we've had it where we've seen sort of unexpected increase in sales. So then you're running out of stock in the market. So then you're having to pay more to your manufacturers to sort of get bumped up on the packaging slots. And then as well, it's the returns, I think, from the market. So we've seen in our distributors, we used to get quite a lot of returns from wholesalers because they have specific agreements. And then it was, or can we turn around them and put them back out for sale? Mm-hmm. So improving those processes so we could get those packs back in and then back out again, and not having to sort of write them off just because a wholesaler doesn't want them anymore, because some of the agreements we had in place sort of allowed them to return it within a specific amount of time. It's sort of improving those processes so that those packs aren't just sort of taken back in and then destroyed because they're not sellable when they actually are sellable.
Yeah. And with the forecasting bit, I think it's the age-old problem in most companies in terms of manufacturers over or under forecasting. Was there something specific that you did internally to improve that? Was there a CRM upgrade, or was it a more human element in terms of working with the sales team to get the forecast tighter? How did you do it?
I think for us, it was more the human element. So when I sort of first joined, the supply chain team and the commercial team probably didn't speak as much as they should have done. So it was kind of like, well, we're going to sell this. And then it's kind of like, well, actually, we're probably not going to sell that. And it's kind of that balancing act. But over the years I've been at sort of Neurocrine and Immedica, it's definitely improved, and we've definitely got closer to our commercial team so that the forecasting's got tighter, and it's kind of more realistic now that we're able to produce against that. And then we've also implemented quite a sort of extensive S&OP process. So we have sort of 3 or 4 meetings a month on the S&OP basis, so different functions, and then it's one big meeting altogether.
Right. Okay. And how much did you? I mean, roughly in terms of your forecasting, how effective has that been? Have you got a percentage in terms of how accurate you are now? And are there still improvements you need to make, do you think?
There's definitely still improvements. I can't really give a percentage, I don't think. It's just, I know definitely at the beginning we were kind of having to right side the production planning as well, because we were literally, most of our stock that was coming out, and once it was actually hitting the market, had such a small amount of time left on the expiry, we were having to sort of either hold it back or give customers the sort of right of return on all the products we were selling, just because they didn't have enough expiry left, but we were trying to get it out the door rather than sort of destroying it. But in terms of, I can't give percentage because it was still a little bit wayward, but it's definitely better. We're not holding on to as much. We're sort of running down to where we want to be, where we're hitting that sort of, we had a target of having, when we had the replenishments come in, having a 3 months buffer stock on hand at that point. So we're a lot more sort of hitting that target now than we were beforehand.
Yeah. Okay, nice. And I think a lot of people on sort of, obviously the relationship between the 3PL and the carrier is always critical within this sector. And How do you manage those relationships? How do you go about selecting your carriers? What are you looking for, especially around temperature sensitive, sort of time critical products that you're trying to ship?
So for me, sort of like building those relationships with them is the open communication piece. I think it's really important, especially with the products that we're shipping and the size of the company. We know we're not going to be their biggest customer, and we're probably going to be quite far down their list of priorities most of the time if we go to those bigger competitors. So definitely open communication both ways. So if we're doing something wrong, I kind of would hope that the 3PLs would be telling us, oh, you can improve your processes this way to improve efficiency and reduce risk. And also going the other way as well, where we can kind of give them suggestions on how they can improve their process, especially for our products. Just like that, and sort of trying to make them an extension of our business because they are the ones physically handling the products and shipping them for us. So they're really important that they kind of understand just how important the products are for us and for the patients.
Yeah, on a sort of temperature sensitive product, how involved are you with, for example, action of the data monitoring devices or the packaging in those lanes, or do you leave that up to your 3PL and carrier to decide that and spec it within their overall brief?
So we are directly responsible. So we purchase all of our data loggers and the packaging as well. So we have to, because of our processes, we have to qualify each of the packaging solutions that our freight forwarders use. So we're directly responsible for that.
Okay, fine. Is most of your shipments air or ocean or road, or what are you currently shipping in terms of your main model?
So most of it's road freight. So because most of our markets are sort of intra-Europe, we do a bit of air freight out to the US, and then Israel was our other big market. But most of it was, is road freight. So it's fairly just sort of dedicated trucks with temperature monitors rather than packaging. But then we were looking at opening a manufacturing site in the US to bring stuff over to. So we were looking at sea freight there as well.
Yeah. Okay. And so when a distribution failure happens, which obviously it does, and everyone has these problems come along, especially in the current climate, what does good crisis management actually look like in practice, and how do you manage those situations?
I think it's being as open and honest as possible. I think communication, I think we've touched on it before, is like key to this sort of stuff. I'd much rather someone come to me and tell me that we've had an issue with this product, this has gone wrong, this is how we think we can fix it, rather than sort of trying to sort of hide it and mask it, like sort of cover it up a little bit. We've had both sides of it. We've seen one supplier there, the way the hospital ordered, it wasn't really their fault, but the way the hospital ordered, they'd put in 200 capsules where our bottles come as sort of bottles of 50. So the salesperson at the distributor had accidentally entered in 200 bottles, shipped it out to the customer and quickly realised, but by the next day they'd kind of already organised the redeliver, the recollection, got it back in, they were going to get back into stock. They'd sort of done retraining on their system. They were going to implement retraining on their system. No additional cost to us, but they kind of fully admitted that they'd had this issue and it was kind of their fault when they were doing retraining. So for us, it's kind of like sort of a bit of a just take a breath, kind of like it's nice to see that, because I know stuff goes wrong. I think everyone in the industry, you're never going to have 100%. You're never going to just run without problems. So just being open and honest is something that I really look for in good crisis management. It definitely separates out sort of the good suppliers from the bad suppliers. And it's definitely something that we look for going forward, because we've seen it before where they've kind of hidden stuff for sort of months on end and not told us. And then it's kind of like, well, how do we deal with this now? We can't do anything with that stock, or we're having issues further down the line. How is that going to affect us, the company, further down the line? So just being open and honest and coming up with solutions rather than having to wait for us to tell them what to do.
Yeah, nice, I agree. And if we just touched on sort of cold chains specifically, where do most cold chain sort of failures tend to happen, specifically on road freight? Because obviously that's where majority of what your product ship through. Is it sort of technical, human? Is it the packaging? Is it the regulatory issues? Talk us through the challenge you face around road freight and temperature.
I think it's mainly human. So you might have a driver that doesn't set the vehicle at the correct temperature, or maybe there's an accident, which isn't kind of really human, but the warehouse is loaded at the wrong temperature, or they not put the data loggers in. But what we find and what the regulators will normally pull us up on is if you have like a kappa or you have a deviation going on, it's never really just human error. There's always a process behind there that needs tightening up, or needs to be reviewed, like a work instruction needs to be changed to make sure that that operator doesn't make that mistake again, or there needs to be further training for the staff. So maybe the training hasn't been as good, or so I think it's mainly sort of human error, but it's definitely processes behind that which normally causes the downfall. And it's always something that can be tightened up on the back of a sort of issue. Yeah,
and in terms of the sort of the tech piece, in terms of mitigating risk, real-time temperature monitoring and IoT have obviously come more and more to the fore in the last few years and will continue to be, I think. How's it transforming operations for you? What impact has it had? What benefits have you seen?
So we kind of just started getting into that space the last couple of years. So we've been trialing out sort of the real-time tracking data logs because we've just been using the SensorTech Temptel Ultras for years, and I think that's pretty much what the industry standard was. But we'd started actually looking at sort of real-time tracking data loggers, and we'd started trialing them, and actually during that trial it really came out just how valuable having that data is, because we had a couple of shipments that were actually going by air freight. We had 2 separate shipments going at different times, but they were going into Israel, and obviously in the current climate it's quite likely there's going to be delays, especially with air freight. So we had one shipment that went out, it got stuck at a transit airport hub because the flights got cancelled, and we could actually see that data, we could actually see that shipment, the temperature was holding fine even if it'd gone out side of the sort of validation period for the packaging it was in. When it arrived at the customers, we could say, look, it's been delayed, but we've got the data to back it up to say it's still fine. There's no temperature excursions on the shipment, so it can be released. We had another one which pretty much exactly the same, but at the transit hub it wasn't stored at the correct temperature during transit. So the packaging actually sort of failed. So we could see it sort of creeping down and down and down below the sort of 15 to 25 temperature range that was meant to be held at. And then when it went outside of that, we were actually able to take that data and get our quality team, get our CMC team involved, and actually sort of raise the deviation, look at the data, look at our stability data that we had on hand, and then sort of make a decision on that product that to say that actually by the stability data, the product's still fine. So once it arrived at the customer's site, we could tell them, look, we've had a deviation during transit, but actually the product's fine. So without any further delay, you can still release the product. And it just takes that sort of additional time. It probably would have taken an extra week, 2 weeks maybe for us to close that deviation off. And once it arrived at the customer's warehouse, and they may have been out of stock in the market, so then we're able to still continue to supply the patients. So having those real-time data loggers is sort of key. I know some people are still maybe a little bit against it and kind of still don't see the value in it, but we saw it straight from the trial period for the data loggers.
Okay, so previously would those products still have got through, but it's a time delay?
So it's like, because we would have had to wait for them to arrive at the customer's warehouse and then them download the data loggers, tell us there's an issue with the temperature. We then take that data, we then start doing the normal deviation process, getting assessments done by the CMC team and our quality team, and then feeding back to the customer. So it can take sort of, depending on when we get the data back, and that could take an extra week or 2 weeks before we can actually release that product.
Understood. And on your real-time monitoring, if you see there's a delay and you can see the shipping parcel or pallet mainly in terms of...
It's mainly just a couple of pallets at a time maximum.
So if you see a pallet sort of deviating or getting out of range or there's a delay, is it possible for you to react at that time with your forwarding or 3PL partner, or is really you have to wait until that pallet's gone through the supply chain and see what happens at the other end? How do you manage that?
It kind of depends on where the pallet is. So these ones are at like an airline's transit hub. So I think we'd kind of made the decision that it probably wasn't worth trying to get them to bring it out and repackage it during that, just because it's an additional handling step and they could go wrong there. Like the airline might mishandle it, or there could be further delays because if we pulled it out of the airline, they may not have another flight until the following week or whatever, depending on the situation in the area. So at that point, we had decided to sort of just leave it as is. But depending on where it is, we probably would contact the freight forwarder to see if they could either repackage it or pull it back out and try again.
Okay, and then on the last mile delivery is often, I say it's a sort of underdeveloped market, but I think it's a very challenging one for the industry. What's your experience with it? What's worked for you? What hasn't in terms of delivering within that last mile?
I think if you're going to sort of like an underdeveloped market, I think what we found best is to go for sort of like a local partner, because they're going to have the local knowledge, and then quite a lot of the time we've seen that people in that market will prefer to use sort of the local companies anyway, because they sort of know them a bit more, they sort of trust them a bit more, whereas sort of the global organizations try and do a sort of maybe one size fits all solution. So it doesn't always work for us. We've definitely seen it where it may be a little bit more expensive, it may be sort of, but it's going to get the product to the patients where it needs to be. So for us, that's like critical. So having that sort of local support, that local knowledge, different regulations, how hospitals and pharmacies like to order in that country, because every country is different. So just having that local knowledge is really important, especially for the underdeveloped markets for us in that
Yeah.
last mile delivery, because they'll also know who the best carriers are to use in that market as well.
Yeah. And do you find it a challenging area, the last mile, or do you find it's reasonably solid at the moment in terms of deliveries there?
I think it's reasonably solid, but it is where we seem to see most of the deviations, and that's just not in the undeveloped markets. That's in quite a few of the bigger markets as well. That's where we kind of see the damages and the temp excursions happen quite a lot. That's kind of the main reason for our returns from customers, is because they've got received it damaged or there's been a temp excursion. So it's definitely difficult, but I think quite a lot of new companies are trying to get involved. Bigger companies are trying to get involved in it. So hopefully over the next few years, it should improve.
Yeah. Okay, good. And cold chain packaging has come a long way over the last, I don't know, 10 years. It's huge developments in various parts of it. But in terms of your experience, are you still seeing that, I suppose, some packaging is over-engineered for the lane and isn't really adding meaningful benefit? How advanced are we getting in terms of specking the right packaging in the right lane to reduce sort of carbon and waste, etc., as much as we can?
I think, yeah, like you said, like packaging's definitely come a long way over the last 10 years. I mean, I was at Immedica Pharma a couple of months ago, and you saw seeing some companies roll out packaging that lasts over 200 hours as a passive packaging solution, which sort of 10 years ago you'd be sort of dreaming of. But it's kind of down to everyone to sort of understand their lane and the risk on their lane. So having that maximum, how long you think that lane's actually going to take realistically, whether you can sort of build in sort of any delays into that, and then choosing the right packaging for that. Because I've seen it before where someone will select a pallet shipper for a couple of boxes and try and ship it that way, which is completely uneconomical and sort of not very sustainable in terms of the CO2 emissions, especially with air freight. But I think now sort of packaging solutions, the way they're trying to differentiate themselves is with that sort of visibility piece. So we've seen some of them partnering up with those visibility software companies to offer that as like a sort of entry-level standard that comes with every time they use the packaging. You get sort of real-time tracking on that. So I think that's where they're trying to differentiate now. And I think that does help reduce risk, because some people don't want to sort of have a standalone platform for their sort of real-time data logger tracking and stuff like that, because it's just not valuable economically for them. But if it comes with the packaging, then it's definitely an added benefit.
Yeah, no, I totally agreed. And I think there's a lot. I think the infrastructure piece in packaging has changed. I think the technology has obviously moved on quite a lot, but they're still using typically PCM and VIP panels and polyurethane. So the technologies, I suppose, the core components aren't necessarily massively different, but I think that you're quite right. The piece around that and the tech integration, everything else is certainly what's coming, it seems. So interesting to watch this space. So as you said, you were at Immedica Pharma in Vienna this year, as I was. What was the conversation that kept coming up that the industry maybe hasn't solved yet? What was happening in the room?
I think when I was having discussions there, is around the resilience piece and how you can build those supply chains to make them as resilient as possible. And I think there's probably going to be a conversation that's going to be going on for years and years, because every year something else seems to crop up. I think for the industry to deal with, you've got like the Ukraine wars, you've got COVID, you've got Trump in the Middle East. Kind of every year seems to get worse and worse, but almost
more challenging for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely a more challenging. So I don't think it's ever going to change. And I think one of the other big conversations is around the AI sort of piece and how you integrate that into your supply chain, how far you integrate that into your supply chain. I think everyone had a difference of opinion on it whenever I spoke to someone different.
Opinion on it, yeah. So on AI and everything else, how involved are you with it within your current business, your team? Are you seeing any real benefit, genuine benefit from using it within there, or do you think it's still got a little way to go in terms of taking on a lot of the roles and improving things?
Yeah, so my current sort of role, we hadn't really implemented yet. We were looking at it towards the end of last year, sort of getting a new sort of supply chain software in which utilised AI. But we've started looking at about 2 to 3 years. And I think how far those pieces of software have come along in the last 2 to 3 years, there's definitely been a massive jump from kind of it being sort of not a gimmick, but something nice to have. Whereas now I think, even though it probably wasn't 100% beneficial for us at this point, if we were looking to scale and grow, I think you need to get that in now so you can trial it out, get it into the company, because it is definitely an added benefit. I mean, we were looking at Immedica Pharma, I think Takeda Pharmaceuticals did a presentation, and they sort of did a whole temperature mapping in one of their new warehouses just using AI. They didn't put any probes around the warehouse. And they just used AI software, and that was actually approved by the sort of regulatory body in the country. So that kind of time saving on resources, I think, is going to be critical, especially for the sort of smaller biotechs. If you can free up people's time by just having AI in there to sort of do everyday tasks. I mean, some of them now will pull weather data and traffic data and give you sort of meaningful suggestions on how you can reroute shipments if needed based on that data. So I think it's definitely going to be meaningful. I don't think it's ever going to replace the human element of the job, but as a sort of tool that people can use, definitely think it's getting there. And I think in the next couple of years, it's going to get even bigger.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's sort of two sides, isn't it? It seems AI is producing huge amounts of information and data, and IoT and monitoring is giving us huge amounts of information. And the other side, AI has got to then sift through the data and give us the right pieces to plug out, make decisions from. So, it's it goes full circle. And you mentioned a bit around resilience there earlier, and that had been a good conversation over at Logipharma. And obviously, post the pandemic in 2020, and then we seem to have gone, as you say, from geopolitical issue to another issue. How much more resilient do you think the supply chains are now than maybe 5-6 years ago, or do you think there's still a long way to go in terms of improving them?
I think they're definitely slightly more resilient. I think you see people looking more at like the dual sourcing models or more regional sourcing models, especially with what's going on sort of geopolitically. So having multiple manufacturing sites and packaging sites in different continents to support those markets. So you're kind of insulated a little bit more if there's sort of wars going on or there's another COVID and all the flights stop. But I think in terms of it's never going to get to a point, I think especially within the pharmaceutical industry, like the cost pressure is always going to be there because you typically see that for a life cycle of a product, so 5-10 years, whatever it is before it goes off patent or whatever, you don't really see a price increase. So if you're especially in Europe, so America I think is a bit more insulated, but especially in Europe, the likelihood of you seeing a price increase for your product across its lifespan is next to zero. So I think companies definitely, especially ones that are kind of like the smaller biotechs, you've got to look at that sort of bottom line quite closely, because if you start increasing supply chain costs, and that eats into your margins, which then could potentially eat into you being able to develop new products for the market. So I think the cost pressure is definitely still there, but I think people see the benefit of a resilient supply chain, especially since COVID.
Yeah, yeah, and something else I think it's come up a lot on here and talking to customers that is obviously the forefront of their mind is sustainability, and how are you and your team approaching sustainability, and what are you focusing on there?
So for us, it's, I guess, essentially looking at different ways of shipping. So from the US, like for our US lane, we could have looked at air freight, and that probably would have been the typical solution for us, but we're looking at sea freight just because there's a reduction in sort of CO2 emissions based on that, especially as we're kind of shipping sort of 10 pallets at a time. But I think it's also looking at the packaging solution. So we would typically use sort of single-use solutions, so the sort of expanded polystyrene solutions, stuff like that. But we are still looking at a sort of a reusable solution. So maybe looking more at the sorts of Sky Cells, the Envirotainers, that where it doesn't just get used once and thrown away. As well as I think you're seeing the packaging companies come up with different solutions as well. So I think there's the one company that I've been sort of speaking to and sort of tracking their progress over the last couple of years has been using sort of recycled feathers as an alternative to sort of the polystyrene sort of insulation, and they've been seeing really good results. But obviously that also comes with a sustainability piece where they're taking sort of old feathers from pillows and stuff like that, and then also that's just biodegradable. Once it's finished, it can be sort of easily disposed of without it causing any issues for the environment. And I think as well, with all the regulations coming in place, we're seeing it in sort of the packaging in terms of how much you have to declare, in terms of how much plastic you're using, how much packaging cardboard you're using. We're now getting countries that are implementing sort of costs and recycling fees. So we have to declare all your packaging in those countries and then pay a fee. I think it's more of, before it was a luxury, sort of trying to be as sustainable as possible. I think it's now a necessity for the industry to sort of be more sustainable.
Yeah, yeah, and you're right. I think there's so many ideas that is coming up around sustainability. It's recycling the packaging, it's renting and reusing it, or as you say, the components going in there can be wool, or they could be sheep's wool, or they can be feathers, or they can be a myriad of different types of insulation. And I think there's lots of. I think we were talking to a supplier the other day who was talking around then repurposing his packaging at destination for their different industry. So just pulling the packaging apart and then reselling it on for a different industry to then put into, say, buildings, etc. I think there's lots of really good things happening there. And I think it's a combination of working with 3PL pharma companies like yourselves and the packaging manufacturers to get a good solution in. But it's an interesting time there with lots of innovation. Just I know we're sort of running a slightly close to the end of the session here, but in terms of wrapping things up, what's one thing you change about pharmaceutical distribution and how it operates and over the next few years? What improvements would you like to see?
This one's probably more of a personal preference, but I think it's looking at how, so for me, sort of account managers at some of the customers, they're more customer service based rather than actually having knowledge of the operation. So for us as a small operation, I always prefer dealing with someone who's had either operational experience or is the person handling the shipment. I've seen sort of some of the bigger companies that we sort of looked at, and what I've used in the past is very much the customer service team is separate from the operations team. And I think for something like pharmaceuticals, it's really necessary to have someone that has operational experience that you can contact straight away if you think something's going wrong or you need advice. I think that's something I'd like to change, is that you deal with someone from operations rather than a customer service team member.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. Yeah, I can imagine the frustration there of having to jump between departments, and you want to deal with an expert, don't you, on the end of a call. Yeah, spot on. And so if we sat down in 2 or 3 years' time, what sort of innovations excite you? What do you think the industry might move towards that could be a real step or game change in terms of moving pharma by sort of air, ocean or road for it within temperature?
I think for me, it's definitely, I think we've touched on it, it's the AI piece of it. I think seeing what it was 2 or 3 years ago and then looking forward what it's going to be in 2 to 3 years' time, I think it's going to be a massive game changer for everyone in the industry. I think it's going to be important for people to get probably in on the ground level now, even if you don't think you need it. But I think in 2 to 3 years' time, it's going to just increase in terms of what it can offer to a company, in terms of making them more agile, being able to sort of save money, and increase their ability, increase the sort of supply chain's ability, and increase resilience across the supply chain. I think that's something that I'm really excited for. I think, like we touched on, packaging's kind of got to where it needs to be, I think, in terms of where it needs to be in terms of the performance. But yeah, the AI piece of it, being able to integrate that into companies and into their supply chains, I think is definitely going to be the biggest game changer going forward.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Okay, well, we're out of time, Nathan. I really appreciate you coming on today and sharing some excellent stuff there. So if people want to sort of reach out to you, going to any more events this year? Will you be at Logipharma next year? What's your schedule like?
So I'll probably definitely be at Logipharma next year. I think it's definitely something I like to go to every year because it seems to change, it seems to get bigger and bigger. But that's probably it for now. But if anyone wants to reach out, then just please contact me on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy for people to reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Good man. Brilliant. Okay. Well, again, thank you for coming on.
No, thank you for having me.
A pleasure. So you've been listening to Cold Chain Insights. My name's Thomas Hunt. Please tune in next week for our next guest, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.